Hello and welcome back to the Transfer Flow podcast. It's me, your host, Patrick Van Straten, and I'm joined by my co-host, Ravi Ramaneni. Good to see you, Ravi.
Good to see you, Patrick.
Today we've got a special guest as well, Ravi. Sorry, got to move on from you very quickly because we've got Ali Maxwell here from NTT20. We wanted to bring you some Football League content. And so today we really thought that we could have a focus on the Championship, which I think we'd probably all agree is one of the most exciting, chaotic leagues in Europe. Already a managerial change one game into the season. Ali, it's really great to have you here. Thank you for coming on.
No, massive thank you for the invitation. I've been listening to the pods. I've been reading the daily newsletter. I've been really enjoying the addition of the Transfer Flow to my life, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. So to get the call up's a real pleasure. Cheers.
Well, here at the Transfer Flow as well, we're trying to, I guess we're trying to get some expertise into a space which is sometimes full of opinion at the expense of backing it up. And I think when it comes to the Championship, certainly I am the most annoying kind of fan where I sort of take an interest when it gets exciting, which, to be fair to the Championship, is quite often. I mean, last year, it was 12 points between relegation and the upper half of the table. Absolutely chaotic, obviously huge financial rewards, players looking to prove themselves. So today we thought that we'd do a little preview. And maybe if we could start with some of those managerial changes, because it's been a relatively busy off-season, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think so. It's an interesting league where at the top of it, we're currently in a situation where, from a neutral's point of view, it doesn't feel great. That's because the teams that come down from the Premier League have the odds stacked in their favour for a few different reasons. And certainly last season, it was Leeds, Southampton, Leicester who were straight away challenging for promotion. And thankfully, the reason why the league is still worth covering is we also had the footballing miracle, if you like, of Ipswich Town, who ended up achieving back-to-back promotions from League One to the Premier League, showing that there is still some mobility, some reason to dream, really. However, the reality is for a lot of the teams that don't have parachute payments, it's really difficult to actually challenge for automatic promotion. Most of them are fighting for a chance to go up through the playoffs, as Luton did, of course, 2 seasons ago. But I think what is really exciting, and you touched on it, is the relegation battle last season was incredible. And this might seem counterintuitive, but one of the reasons I think that is I think the quality of the league has improved. And by that, I don't mean the quality of the best teams. I mean the general sea level has risen over the last 5 seasons or so. I think teams, probably not just in the Championship, but this is my area of expertise, teams have got smarter. Teams make better decisions than they did 5-10 years ago, particularly when it comes to squad building. In some cases, when it comes to managerial appointments. And so the worst teams in the Championship last season were quite good compared to normal relegation fodder. And it meant that it was just this almighty scrap. Because this is always the case in relegation scraps, loads of teams tried to sack managers and hire other ones to try and get a little boost. For a couple of them, it worked. For many of them, it did not work at all. So that part of the division, I think, will always be exciting, whatever happens at the top of it. A few teams have made changes this summer. I think coming down from the Premier League, Burnley obviously losing Vincent Kompany. They've hired Scott Parker, who's an amazing case study in football management, I think, in that he has 2 promotions from the Championship in 2 goes with Fulham and with Bournemouth.
Yeah.
And in the old days, that would be enough to call him the king of the Championship. But these days, there's still other ways you can look at a manager and judge a manager. And maybe some of the more analytically minded people would wonder whether he's actually ever shown much more than was expected of him. And particularly when he's got to the Premier League with those 2 teams, it's not gone well at all. So he's tasked with getting Burnley up. That would be his 3rd Championship promotion. And then I think the more interesting ones are some of the existing Championship teams. So Hull City sacked Liam Rosenior, and their owner, who's a pretty interesting character. He's known as the Turkish Simon Cowell because of his fame over in Turkey. It all comes from game shows, entertainment shows. He's a huge character. And he basically sacked Liam Rosenior because he thought the football was boring. So in fairness to him, hiring Tim Walter, who's recently been with Hamburg for a couple of seasons, who missed out on promotion from the second Bundesliga with Hamburg for 2.5 years, but who plays what's apparently called heart attack football. He is going for pure entertainment. Sunderland hired a guy called Régis Lebris from Lorient, suffered relegation from Ligue 1 last season. I think the consensus was he did a great job the year before, but maybe gravity caught up with them a little bit. His background is in youth development, much more than actual tangible results as a senior manager. And that's what Sunderland have turned to. And Norwich, similarly, with Johannes Hoff-Torup, who was at Nordsjælland, really young. I think he's like 35, but very modern, sort of pure coaching background, has worked his way up and now gets the job with Norwich. So different clubs taking kind of different approaches, but the theme generally being they're not hiring the sort of old school championship types managers that maybe people would think are synonymous with the Football League. It really has changed a lot in the last few years. And I think those three appointments kind of show it.
And
yeah, that
I guess
Norwich. Sorry, Ravi.
One question I have about, I mean, obviously there's one which felt like that type of signing is Wayne Rooney. One that at transfer flow, we didn't expect him to get another gig in the championship, and he ended up at Plymouth, and who I think the previous year when they got promoted, they had a really, really good manager, and I think that was a little bit of head scratcher. What did you think about it?
For sure, yeah, it is. I mean, you guys, and particularly like the background of you guys who have worked within the game, I'm sure you know that managerial recruitment is so important and so difficult. And it's also a bit unfair because Plymouth being a good example of this, they hired Ryan Lowe, who had never managed at senior level before. And Ryan Lowe was really good. And Ryan Lowe got hired by a team in the league above from Preston. So then they hired, or rather they promoted Ryan Lowe's assistant, Stephen Schumacher. And it was a fantastic decision. The choice not to find a new manager, but to go with the continuity approach was brilliant. And Schumacher won them promotion, and they started pretty well in the championship last season. So they had made all these good decisions to get up to the championship, where they now are very much punching above their weight. And then Stephen Schumacher got hired by Stoke City, who have deeper pockets. He was tempted away. So 2 managers in a row that left rather than were sacked. I think that suggests pretty good decision making. That's an impressive ratio. Then the hire that they made after that went terribly. A guy called Ian Foster, who had like England youth team history, and they felt would probably help them with some premium loanees because of that background, and was known as these guys often are, as really talented coaches on the grass and tacticians. Didn't work at all from a character point of view, and they've been very open about that for whatever reason. That the way that he approached things and essentially the impact of his personality on the dressing room and the club just caused absolute disaster. They managed to stay up just about when the director of football took charge for the last few weeks of the season, and then they turned to Rooney. So it is kind of surprising. His spell at Birmingham went about as badly as it could have done, and Birmingham's relegation from the championship boils down to that period. Now, not all of it is just Rooney as a complete disaster. It was a bizarre shift of style of play, which the club seemingly wanted. And it just wasn't appropriate for the players that they had. Equally, his communication was poor. His organization of the team was poor. And so it was a surprise to see him get another championship job. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw, but they lost 4-0 on opening day to Sheffield Wednesday, who racked up 4.85 XG, the most. No one hit that number in the championship for the whole of last season. Plymouth looked completely at sea, and it was a terrible start for Rooney. So there's a part of me that wants to feel like there might be something there, but increasingly it's looking hard to see.
What do you think that their theory was that Rooney could give them? Because, they finished 21st last year, and you look at their underlying numbers, and they were third worst in the league by expected goal difference. The defence was truly shocking. But obviously, maybe they've made the determination that some of the upheaval was the reason for that. But it feels like you need this squad to play above its level in such a competitive league. Do you have a bead on why they might think that Rooney is the guy to make that happen?
Yeah, it can't be because they felt confident that as a tactician, he would build a team that's, to kind of use a similar phrase to how you just did, like more than the sum of its parts, and they are fighting up against it in terms of squad quality. They can't have felt that because a lot of that stuff often comes down to building a defense first and foremost, and then hoping that you can generate some attack on top of that. And he doesn't have a great track record there. I do believe it comes down to this shock that they had from appointing a guy in Ian Foster, who just in terms of personality and his background just didn't work at all. And I think, it's a frustration of guys like yourselves, those who think analytically, and for us as well on the podcast, that clubs do, have such strong reactions to one bad experience. But I do think that might be the case here, where I think they might have thought, well, we didn't do enough due diligence on the character side of things, aside from anything football related. So now we want to focus on getting someone that we think will galvanize the dressing room, the club, the fan base, and hope that on top of that, he's got the kind of coaching chops as well. It doesn't immediately look like a great decision because although the noises were all very positive this summer, it sometimes does feel like when you've replaced a really unpopular manager, everyone's very keen to tell you how happy everyone is now, because they want to pin everything on the guy before, and they don't want to take much responsibility for themselves sometimes. So the noises were all good this summer, that the players were enjoying Rooney, that he's a good character to have around. I think his media persona is very different to how he is behind the scenes, from what I'm led to believe, which is not that surprising given he spent his whole life under the media spotlight. So, I do gather that he's a great person to have managing your team, in terms of the players generally like him. But I think, as we all know, like poor results just wipe that stuff out so quickly that I don't think he's got a particularly long leash here.
On that, I wanted to come. Something you said there kind of reminded me of. There's this disconnection sometimes, isn't there, between how a manager actually performs and how they're perceived, and kind of in the way that we've seen this. It's almost like there's an intolerance kind of growing, I think, in football generally, but in the Championship, for playing what's seen as passive, old-fashioned football, the kind of football you saw in the Championship 20 years ago. It feels like this was really the bullet that was fired that kind of hit Ryan Lowe, would you say?
Yeah. So Lowe has left Preston, where I think he was manager for about 2.5 years. He was, at that point, the second longest serving manager in the Championship. So you've got Mark Robbins at Coventry, who's done like 7 years. And then the next best now is Paul Warne, who's done 1 year and 10 months. So that gives you an idea of the sort of churn we're looking at this level. Lowe and Preston have parted company, apparently by mutual consent. They lost 2-0 to Sheffield United on Friday night, a result that on paper is nothing to be ashamed of, but the fans have been getting increasingly restless over what they perceived as a lack of style, basically, and a manager who outwardly and publicly was at loggerheads with the fans. Basically, he didn't agree with their analysis of how his team played, but they felt like what he was telling them was completely at odds with what they were watching. And that's an awkward situation to be in. Objectively, in terms of their league finish, he did a pretty good job. They have finished 12th or 13th pretty consistently for the last couple of seasons, and their budget would be much lower than that. So he would rightly point to an overachievement, and maybe to the fact that he did get a group of players to get results that were maybe above their station in terms of squad quality. But the underlying numbers were terrible last season. Their whole campaign was propped up by this insane hot streak to start the season, where I think they won 6 of their first 8, and then another little burst in February. But if you took the majority of the campaign and the consistently poor underlying numbers, this was the sort of team that we looked at pre-season and thought, hold on, this is a bit of a ticking time bomb, because there's nothing special happening here as we see it to mean that they would continue to outperform their underlying numbers so significantly. And there's this sort of awkwardness already between manager and fan base, which can really disrupt. So yeah, he's out. And I'm just fascinated to see where the club turn, because I think there's a real, you're clearly hiring managers without experience at the level and in their position, budgetary wise, managers who want to play more expansive football. There is huge reward and huge risk to it. I would say if they go down that path, I would I would back them to be relegated much more than I would back them to fly up the table. I think he maybe had them pretty much at their max. So it's a bit of an awkward situation, but you're right that the trend of the league is to be hiring managers who play expansive, for want of a better word, progressive football as it's kind of considered now. I don't necessarily think it's a panacea for success unless you have incredible talent at your disposal. You know, Russell Martin and Enzo Maresca, their Leicester and Southampton sides were the highest possession teams, the teams that played the most passes, that held the ball for the longest, that played this extreme possession style. But I wouldn't say that was the reason necessarily for them being the best teams in the league. I think the talent advantage that they had was what made that, you know, even more powerful. So it does make me a little nervous when teams who are at a disadvantage in terms of budgets and squads take this approach. It's a really tough one to call.
Yeah, I
Ravi,
think we have just wanted to add to the point, you know, that's something that I notice with teams where teams that are in terms of their financial might are much lower in strength than the teams at the higher level and want to play the same style, then A, you are competing for the same players, but then you're going to lose. B, then you're ending up with lesser players who play the same style. So again, you're at a disadvantage playing that style. So it's important to identify the players that you can get in your budget that can still get you the results, and probably have to compromise a little bit on the style to be able to achieve a bit of both instead of going one way or the other.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's, you know, I think we can look at, I'm certainly guilty of looking at tactics quite almost too simplistically and focusing on possession and on pressing. But I think there is like quite a nice middle ground that we're starting to see with some of the managers at the level, as the football looks very, very different now than it did a few years ago, where actually there's now a bit of a zag towards having the really big physical striker at the top of the pitch, not necessarily so that you go long all the time or as a large percentage of your build-up play, but actually because you want to bait that press. And at this level, you don't always have the players who can handle the extreme nature of like really short build-up. So just being able to have that outball is quite important. So now I would say a real trend this summer has been the signing of mostly overseas players, actually, because there aren't many players like this in English football, of like 6'3", 6'4" guys who play up front, who cover ground quickly, who are probably best in transition rather than in tight spaces, a lot of whom can be very hit and miss in terms of actual like finishing ability, but who are offering what these clubs need just in terms of having a sort of release when they play it up the pitch quickly. So I think tactically it is quite an interesting league. I don't necessarily think that in order for a mid-table team to punch above its weight, playing a really heavy possession-based style is correct. But you have to be able to teach some patterns of build-up in order to kind of open the pitch up at this point, because teams, teams are so comfortable defending deep these days that mostly championship clubs who need to break down low blocks, they don't tend to do it particularly well either.
So I think from there it kind of makes sense for us to move on to promotion and relegation, because obviously we're talking about the ways that you can move around in this league, and it does feel like a big signing, a new manager, a very distinct tactical style, it can push you up a few places, and a few places in this division is the difference between, really life and death. We didn't want to force you to predict all these places because you've already done a fantastic prediction episode on NTT20, which we will link and which I really recommend everybody check out. But are there any stories that you think we should be looking out for in particular from the promotion or the relegation battles?
For me, the most interesting thing is always if you take out the teams that have come down from the Premier League, because they can be very distracting at this time of the season. Almost all of them have loads of work to do, quite often just in terms of getting players out who don't want to be there or who might be able to make them some quick cash. And so teams like Burnley at the moment, Sheffield United, and to a different extent, Luton, who haven't done a lot of business in or out, but who started the campaign looking pretty light on their, in terms of quality. So there's still loads of work to do there, which can give this idea that they are in chaos and they will struggle. but invariably they are fine. And within like a month of the season, you realise that they're probably the best teams. You know, the big name in the league is Leeds United, left over from last season. They came fourth in a 3-horse race. Any other season, they would have been promoted with the season that they put together. Really good side. And, you know, I've been watching Ted's, you know, the first few videos that he's done on the betting side, and his model, just like all the others that we've seen, has them the most likely winners, even including the 3 teams that have come down. So, you know, Leeds are kind of the team to beat. For me, the most interesting thing is always which of the other teams will make the leap this year. You know, in my eyes, the most likely would be Middlesbrough and Coventry, who both finished just outside the playoffs last season, but both of whom, to my eyes, look like they're on a journey of like fairly consistent progression that might see them take a big jump this year with a couple of, you know, with young players that are a year older, more experienced, more developed, with, you know, pretty authoritative and settled managers, good style of play. Both, you know, Middlesbrough create a lot of chances, not so good defensively. Coventry, you know, more of a balanced side. Those are probably the 2 that, you know, if you said who might be in the Premier League next year that isn't the 4 favourites, I would guess one of those 2.
In terms of the strength of the teams, that would you think that, you know, last year or 2 years ago, the teams that came down were Southampton, Leeds, and Leicester. This year, Sheffield United, Burnley, and Luton. Does this group of teams that got relegated from the Premier League give more hope to the rest compared to those other 3, even though Leeds is still in the division?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, because that was, and I can't remember if it was talked about at the time or if people didn't really think like this, but for Leicester, Leeds, and Southampton to have all come down at the same time was a complete aberration. Invariably, there is a team or 2 that go straight back down from the Premier League. That season, they all stayed up. And, you know, a team like Leicester had no designs on getting relegated up to that point. No, I doubt anyone would have predicted that coming. Southampton had felt established to an extent at that level, albeit they'd been kind of on the decline a little. And then Leeds are obviously, you know, they had punched their way up into the top half under Bielsa, and they were sliding back down when they lost the quality of Bielsa. But for all 3 of those to come back down was pretty crazy. And for sure, it is an easier, or should be an easier division to get relegated, to get promoted from this season with the teams that have come down.
Do you ever see a difficulty with teams readjusting to the start of the Championship? Because obviously, you know, teams going up to the Premier League from the Championship, they are often teams who have a lot of the ball, teams who are expected to dominate their games. Then they go up to the Premier League and they're expected to play a totally different way. And often we don't give enough credit, I think, to managers like Thomas Frank, who could adapt to a different style of football. But obviously in the Championship, you've got teams coming up from a lower division where they will probably have this problem, and teams coming down from a higher division, they've got to go back to playing dominant front foot football, having spent a year maybe trying to defend without the ball. Does this add to the chaos?
A little, I would say. Actually, teams that come down from the Premier League don't seem to find it very difficult to adapt to needing to dominate. I think they just generally have the players and or hire the managers that are suited to that. As you've alluded to, the issue is going up to the Premier League and working out what the hell you're meant to do if you're a team that has scored 100 goals and had 65% of the ball and barely had to defend for large swathes of time. Like, what do you do? I still don't really know the answer. It'll be interesting to see how Southampton get on, because, you know, that is clearly a big red flag for them coming up. Teams don't find it very hard coming down. I mean, the obvious reference point would be Burnley, who got relegated under Sean Dyche, having played Sean Dyche football for many years, and then signed or hired Vincent Kompany, and looked like a completely different football club within 2 months and hit the ground running. Barely took any time to. I think they actually drew a lot of their early games because their finishing was a bit off, but in terms of their dominance and their attractive style of play, it was there already. So, you know, Sheffield United have come down, and in their first game, turns out all those players that looked pretty poor in the Premier League last season and some of their new signings now look great, look like probably one of the best 11s on paper. I just don't think teams find it that difficult coming down, and I think if anything, they kind of enjoy it because they can flex their muscles again. And coming up from League One to the Championship, it's much less difficult just in terms of the style as it is getting up to the Premier League. Like, although there is this difference in ability between the top teams in the Championship and the bottom teams in the Championship, again, it's not nearly as pronounced as it is in the Premier League. And so, you know, the teams that come up from League One generally can more or less stick with their style of play, and that alone isn't necessarily going to be a problem for them.
Interesting.
Yeah, listening to your prediction episode, I was quite surprised that you were pretty bullish on a lot of the teams coming up from League One. I made it slightly more glamorous. Yeah, you seem to give them a pretty good shot of staying up relative to some of the teams in the league who maybe, you know, I'm thinking of Watford with Tom Cleverley in charge. You know, there are teams here who've had significant losses from their squad. I don't really know what I'm asking you there, except that is that a kind of a trend that you see where you think teams coming up cope pretty well? I know we've seen Ipswich and things, but
yeah, for sure. To be fair, we've been doing the predictions for so long that, like, actually we have developed like certain trends that we believe in, or just general stances about the quality of each league and how easy it is for teams to come up and kind of go again and stay up. I think we did have Derby in the bottom three. We have concerns that their style of play, which is mainly like physical and defense first, they were able to dominate League One physically last season. I just don't see that happening again this year, and I don't think they will have enough in terms of either attacking quality individually or a style of play that I think will get them enough goals. So we do have them going back down. But Oxford and Portsmouth, yeah, I think people are often surprised because a lot of people just like to look at squads on paper and kind of decide a league ranking based on that. And it's just not as stark at this level as being able to look at names and rate players and squads and say, well, you know, they're not good enough to stay up, because I think quality coaching, a bit of rhythm and momentum and good feeling can take you quite a long way. It doesn't last forever. So this isn't the case that we think teams come up and they do an Ipswich Town. For sure, that's not the case. But generally in the short term, I think they do tend to adapt fairly well to the level. And then maybe they start feeling the gravity after a season or two.
Mm-hmm.
I think Oxford is another team with really interesting managerial hires in the last few years. Really good ones.
Yeah, some good ones, some less good ones. Yeah, I mean, they went from Carl Robinson, who's a sort of quite a classic, albeit he's not a particularly old manager. He's been around for a long time. He started when he was like 28, 29. He's a real EFL stalwart, like a real vibes guy. Not a lot of defensive organization, you know, incredible contacts book, likes to be really in control and kind of dominate the whole club. And they had some success under him, but it really, you know, as is often the case when you pin the wagon to one guy, when things started going wrong, it really did spiral. So they made a good hire off the back of that, guy called Liam Manning, who was, you know, a bit of a punt in that he'd led MK Dons to third in League One, and then the next season they got relegated after selling a few key players. So no one was quite sure exactly like how to judge this guy who had shown some quality coaching chops and tactical nous, but had really struggled when the going got tough and didn't seem necessarily to have the personality maybe to handle that difficult situation. And this is the balance that EFL clubs have to find, because in the third tier, you don't get the perfect manager unless you hire Kieran McKenna, who I now basically think is the perfect manager. So that hire went well. In fact, it went too well, because he got hired by Bristol City in the league above only 4 months later. And they followed it up with another good one out of the City football group empire, Des Buckingham, who's born and bred in Oxford, an Oxford fan, but who's done all his coaching overseas in New Zealand, and he was managing Mumbai City. And he led them to this incredible promotion through the playoffs, and just really everything clicked at the right time. Finished the season strong, tactical masterclass in the playoffs when they weren't that well fancied, and got off to a winning start against Norwich City on Saturday, looking super sharp, really well drilled, and kind of ready for the campaign where, for example, Norwich still looked a little like they were scratching their heads. So yeah, you know, it's their first time Oxford in the second tier for almost 30 years. They're definitely up against it in terms of like the size of the fan base and the stadium, but they've got a bit of money behind them. I mean, we think that they'll survive this season and see where they go from there.
All right, so it's interesting to kind of get a shape of what we might expect. But who should we be watching specifically on the field? Because we've seen the league lose some stars. I'm thinking specifically of Crescencio Somerville, for example. But who else is really catching your eye ahead of this season? Because as you said, lots of big boys arriving in the league.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Somerville's an interesting place to start because his departure means that Willie Gnonto can move over to the left-hand side if he stays at Leeds, and currently it looks like he will, which I would not have predicted 12 months ago that he would still be at Leeds into a second season in the Championship. He'll now be playing off the left in Somerville's position. That's where I believe he's most comfortable, and scored a goal on opening weekend, cutting in from the left-hand side and firing inside the near post. So Gnonto is a massive name at this level. He's got Italy caps, incredible start to his career, and like Leeds has had a tough couple of years, is still trying to sort of work his way back to the top. So he could be a star of the league this season for sure. I think if I were a neutral, well, I am a neutral, but if I was a neutral watching this and looking for a team to follow, I think Sunderland have to be the answer. Because they're just an amazing club with just this incredibly large and passionate fan base. There always seems to be a lot of drama. But even from a footballing perspective, they have taken this incredibly youth-focused approach to their recruitment and squad building. And it's working pretty well for them. They've got the youngest team in the league. They've got one of the stars of the league in Jack Clark, who is a wide forward that plays off the left, right-footed, dribbles and shoots a lot. May get a move to the Premier League before the end of the month. Then they've also got some proper wonder kid teenagers. Job Bellingham, who is Jude Bellingham's brother, and plays fairly similarly to Jude, albeit I would be surprised if he quite reaches that level, but a really quality operator in his own right, kind of central midfielder, attacking midfielder who can tackle, carry, not an expansive passer, but a smart passer and can score goals as well. And they have a guy called Chris Rigg as well, who is like a kind of Cole Palmer-esque player. He's just turned 17, but he played like 1,000 minutes last season. I expect he'll play more this year. He's just pure technician, but has that like youngster tenacity and energy as well. So Sunderland are a brilliant team to watch. They've hired this manager that plays a really expansive, quite ambitious style of football, and basically whether they're good or bad, it's going to be worth watching. So it's probably Sunderland. There's a couple of other young players that I like. Tom Fellows plays for West Brom, had a really good first game of the season. He plays off the right wing, left footer, has this incredibly quick feet and incredible acceleration that allows him to always get a yard of separation for a cross and a shot. Needs to develop his goal scoring for sure. He's more of a creator at this stage. And then there's a guy who plays for Cardiff called Ruben Colwill, another attacking midfielder, but more of a number 10 who drifts into wider areas to combine. He's like 6'4", 6'5". He's this incredible like unicorn profile. He's had real issues with injury because of the growth spurt that he had. But I think this is a guy who, I'm not sure if he's at the right club with the right manager for this absolute explosion of development. But I certainly think as a player profile, Colwill is a really interesting one. And if they can find a place for him, if he can stay fit, he's the sort of guy that I think in a year's time, everyone in the Premier League will be looking at.
Cardiff are in a kind of weird, they're like Welsh Arsenal at the moment. They've got a lot of ex-Arsenal guys there and a lot of guys who spent a lot of time injured, I've got to say.
Yeah, Callum Chambers just pitched up there this summer. Aaron Ramsey having done the same last summer as well. Yeah, Mark McGuinness is there. Doesn't quite have the pedigree of those two, but former Arsenal as well. Yeah, Cardiff are... I'm not a big fan of their manager, to be honest. And so I don't have great belief in them this season. They were one of those teams that finished 14th maybe with like the second worst underlying numbers in the whole division. Just in open play showed very little quality going forward. Had this incredible set piece record, which should always be applauded and celebrated, but is the sort of thing that makes me a little bit nervous if they were to lose a bit of their edge in terms of set plays. I'm not sure they've got that much to fall back on. So yeah, I'm not that hot on Cardiff overall. Partly down to their manager, but they've certainly got an interesting squad.
Is there anyone you think is being overlooked, whether a new transfer or a young player breaking through? Is there anyone who is kind of like, you know, sometimes you have those pet players, the same way you were talking about Sunderland just now, and I was like, Ian Poveda went there this summer. I would love to see him. Ian Poveda's still 24 somehow.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, Poveda, he's going to be battling with Patrick Roberts, who's another former wonder kid that's career hasn't quite hit the heights, but they'll be fighting for minutes. And Chris Rigg, who I mentioned, that 17-year-old, he's left footer off the right. So a lot of competition for places there. I mean, I've got loads of kind of guilty pleasures, if you like, when it comes to players. One of them, there's a guy called Tyrese Dolan who plays for Blackburn, it doesn't seem to be considered, doesn't have like the good PR to be thought of as really next cab off the rank, so to speak. And it might be because he's only like 5'5", and frankly, I'm not sure he's got the physicality to mix it in the Premier League. But at Championship level, he's still yet to really like break out. I think this could be his year. He's really energetic in the press, but just a nice all-rounder as an attacking player. He can play anywhere across the front line, and he's smart in terms of his IQ, combines with his other attacking players, can score, can create, and I think he's 22. So he's been around for a couple of years now, but I still think he's got a bit more in him in terms of development.
Great. It would be an interesting one to look out for.
For sure.
So I think one last question, Ali, is that what do you think after watching week 1? What are things that you found? Were there any surprises, and were there any things? I knew this was going to go exactly this way.
Very difficult after 1 week, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I think the big result was Sheffield Wednesday 4, Plymouth 0. The Wayne Rooney factor that we discussed, but also the fact that Sheffield Wednesday were the worst team or the second worst team in the league in the first few months of last season. And then they made one of the great managerial hires.
Yeah.
This guy, Danny Röhl, a German manager, incredible coaching pedigree and background. I think Bayern Munich previously. And he's just been transformative for them. And they flew up the table. I think from like November onwards, they had the 6th best record in the league. And so you're always wondering, like, what's the ceiling for a team like that? Can they just go again and finish in the top 6? Or is that a little unrealistic? Do teams work them out a bit? And then they go and win 4-0 on opening day with 30 shots. And you think, okay, did they just play the worst team in the league right now? Or are they genuinely good? So I think Sheffield Wednesday would be the team just to keep an eye on over the next few weeks, just to see what their level is as it kind of as things kind of level out a little bit. That would be the team that I would flag up.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for your time, Ali. It is absolutely fascinating to talk to somebody who's like such an expert on a division that just really does kind of have endless depths to it. There are 100 mini narratives going on in the Championship at any time.
And we never have to talk about VAR. It's unbelievable.
Oh, that does actually sound great. Do you want to plug your own podcast, because it is absolutely fantastic?
I'd love to. It's called Not the Top 20 podcast, and we record on a Monday, recapping the weekend, try and get into as much depth as possible across 3 leagues. And then on a Thursday, we have a betting show. George and I both really enjoy our betting, have done for a long time. And we make some picks ahead of the EFL weekend. Again, a bit like in general football terms, I think in terms of the betting side, and I know that Ted agrees with this, it's a bit more fun than betting on the Premier League, I think, because the gaps between the teams are a bit different, and the odds are a little bit more exciting than you get at the top of the Prem.
It'll be interesting to see who does better at the end of the season when it comes to the Championship, you or Ted.
I think I'd be nervous about taking on Ted in something like this, but we've got the sort of recent history of doing this stuff, so let's see how we go.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming on.
We should probably do a scoreboard sometime. At the middle of the season, we should do a scoreboard show.
Yeah, I think we definitely should. We'll see how it goes at the end of the season. Thank you so much for coming on, Ali. Thank you for your time. And good to see you as always, Ravi. If you enjoy this podcast, then please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Leave us a review because we really do appreciate those and they help us. And obviously make sure that you follow all our socials and subscribe to the newsletter if you haven't already. Thanks very much for watching/listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye.